What a real delight. I live in Chicago, and it is not 75 degrees and sunny in Chicago. And this week of all weeks was such a pleasure to come here and be part of your community and be here in Los Angeles. So thank you so much for the warm welcome and for having me here. I love seeing all of these children here because I am the parent of 3 boys. My oldest son is 21, my middle son is 19, and my youngest son is 11. And I come from a family of 3 boys. And how many people here come from families of boys, right? Or you have a brother, okay, great. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to the boys and the men for a second, and actually to the women and everybody else too. But thank God for sports and for movies sometimes, because otherwise we don't know what men might talk about, right? This is what my brothers and I often observe. And the movie trilogy that my brothers and I grew up on, and that my kids have grown up on, which has grown beyond a trilogy now, is Star Wars. Star Wars is like something we can always talk about. And there's something that makes Star Wars so fascinating. How many of you like Star Wars here? Who's seen Star Wars? Okay, yeah, right? Okay, awesome. So what makes Star Wars so fascinating for so many people? So yes, there's the Force, which is very cool. And there are lightsabers, which are very cool. And there are spaceships and things that blow up. But all the special effects in the world, I'm talking to people who live around show business people, all the special effects in the world can't make up for the lack of a good story, right? And Star Wars has a great story. It's the story of how Darth Vader becomes a bad guy and how he ultimately does tshuva. He turns into a good guy with his dying act. He dies. That's not a spoiler. Okay. All right. Sorry. So believe it or not, I think that the character of Darth Vader offers us some profound lessons about how to be better, more mindful people. And tonight I want to explore 3 of those lessons with you. Okay? So the first lesson is to move from focusing on the fear of losing what we have to embracing what's deeply and truly present here all the time. If my sons were here, they would remind me that Darth Vader is led to the dark side of the Force by his deep fear of loss. We learn in the prequel movies that he has a vision that the people he loves most in his life are going to die, his mother and his wife. And understandably, he freaks out. He becomes consumed by a fear of losing them. And that leads him to try to hold on tighter and tighter. And it leads his heart to be tighter and tighter. He becomes angry, and then he becomes hateful, and then he becomes violent. As Yoda memorably says to him, and I'm going to do it in a Yoda voice, right? He says, "Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering." Also sounds like Grover, because it's the same guy. Okay, come on, a little credit. Yeah, all right, thank you very much. So this happens in the Torah too. You remember the story. Moses goes up to get the Torah from God on Mount Sinai. He's gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And the people become afraid. They say, "Ze Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elanu mimitzrayim lo yadanu mehayalo." This man, Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. They're afraid that they've lost Moses, that he's gone. And so what do? They freak out. They hold on to something really tightly. They come to Aaron and they demand that he make them something they can see and touch. They say, "Kum aseh lanu Elohim," make us a god. And he makes the golden calf. Moses comes back, there's a civil war. It all ends just as Yoda predicted. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. But it also leads God to realize something. We human beings naturally fear loss. We get anxious. And when that happens, our hearts can start to harden up and to close up. And so God makes a concession. Instead of a golden calf, the people will build a mishkan, a tabernacle, and that will be the way they can focus not on what they're afraid of losing, but on what is always right here for them, for us, the divine presence. It's right here, inside each of us. All we have to do is soften our hearts. So the first lesson of being a more mindful person that Darth Vader and Moses teach us is to focus on presence rather than absence. Notice what's here. Notice what's present in our bodies, in our minds, in our emotions. If we pay close enough attention, we might even notice or sense the presence of people and things we think of as absent. Ancestors, loved ones, God. They're all here if we can open our hearts to sense them. The second lesson is a lesson about relationships. Darth Vader is a lonely character for much of his life. To put it gently, he doesn't have many friends. We don't see him socializing, sharing a meal with others, joining the men's club, playing Madden or Minecraft. But you know what ultimately softens his heart is a relationship with a son that he didn't know he had. And this is a spoiler alert, this is Luke Skywalker. Okay, I'm sorry, but dude, if you've gotten this far in life and you didn't know that, I think there's a statute of limitations, right? So setting aside for a moment that he fights a lightsaber duel with Luke and chops off his hand, that's another spoiler, it's clear that from the moment he learns he has a son, something begins to soften inside Darth Vader. It's a gradual process, but ultimately it manifests in Vader sacrificing himself in order to save his son. And through their relationship, Darth Vader's heart becomes unhardened, it becomes softer. And that allows it to break open in the most life-giving way possible. He was always capable of this, but he could only really do it by being in a relationship with another person. The Midrash tells us a beautiful story that teaches a similar lesson. The Israelites were so broken down from centuries of hard labor and oppression and from Pharaoh's decrees that families stopped functioning. Their hearts, understandably, became stopped up. They became disconnected. Husbands separated from wives. Couples couldn't and wouldn't be intimate anymore. Children stopped being born, and with them, the future of the Jewish people. But then the women, because it's always the women who save us, then the women realized what was happening. And they found a way to open up their hearts and reconnect with their husbands. They would take mirrors in hand and invite their partners to look into those mirrors together, to see the reality that they were not alone, that they, in fact, lived in loving relationships, despite all the suffering that the world inflicted. And in the process, the men's hearts were softened. The couple's love was renewed, and procreation happened again. This path to being a more mindful person is the path of relationships. When we spend time with friends and family, when we open our hearts to care for them and allow them to care for us, when we keep our hearts soft, and open. And so that's the second lesson of Darth Vader. Our third and final lesson, and maybe the most memorable one, is the lesson of breathing. What is Darth Vader most famous for? His breathing, right? Which isn't really his own. Think about this for a second. Darth Vader is so deeply injured and wounded, physically, emotionally, spiritually, that he can't even breathe on his own. Instead, he has to be breathed for by a machine. And we all know how it sounds. Like that. Yet at the very end of his life, after his heart has become softened and he gives himself up to save Luke, Vader asks his son to take off his mask, and he takes his last breaths on his own. Our breath is the path to a soft heart that doesn't depend on anything else. It's the path we're most in control of. I'm fond of saying that mindfulness meditation is to mindfulness practices as soccer is to sports. The reason soccer is the most popular sport in the world is because it takes virtually nothing to play. All you need is a ball and some kids, and you can play soccer. No fancy equipment required, and meditation is the same. All you need is a pair of lungs. You could probably do it with one lung. When we bring awareness to our breath, we immediately start to soften our hearts. So this is where, as Rabbi Yoshi asked, I'm going to invite you to try it with me for a second. Close your eyes, sit up a little straighter than you've been sitting. Not rigid, but just a little straighter. If you've been slouching, you can sit up. Close your eyes and just take a deep, good, beautiful breath. Notice the expansiveness that begins to happen. You might feel your heart slowing down just a little bit, softening up. You might notice a feeling of return and reconnection, even after just a few seconds. Amazing. And if we stay with it just a little longer, we can start to open our hearts up to our relationships with loved ones, with friends, with community, with the natural world. And if we stay just a little longer, we can even soften our hearts to let go of what we're afraid of losing for a moment and focus on embracing what's here right now. Those relationships, these sacred moments, the voices of these children, the gift of this breath. Towards the beginning of the Exodus story, you'll recall that Moses comes to the Israelites to tell them of God's intention to liberate them from Egypt, to bring them to the homeland. And this is it, the moment that they have been waiting for 400 years. And we would expect a giant, amazing, hurrah, Moses, you've come to liberate us from the crowd. But what does the Torah tell us? The Torah says when Moses told this to the Israelites, they wouldn't listen to him. Why? Mikotze ruach ume'avodah kasha, because their spirit, more literally, their ruach, their breath, was constricted, was from being beaten down through hard labor. The commentator Rashi offers an amazing comment on this passage. He says, when a person is in a state of constriction, their breathing comes in short gasps. They can't draw long breaths. And we've all felt this at moments of pain, suffering, loss. We might have felt it throughout this divisive presidential election season over the last year, 400 days since last October 7th. We might have felt that kind of short breathing. It's hard to breathe. Our chests are constricted and our hearts can become brittle and hard. But it also works in the other direction. When we bring awareness and intention to our breath, we can make it more expansive and we can open our chests and soften our hearts. And Darth Vader lives most of his life unable to breathe, and his heart is hard as a result. And so this is the third and final lesson. Deep breaths and soft hearts go hand in hand. We've talked about 3 lessons of Jewish mindfulness from the story of Darth Vader, focusing on presence more than absence, investing in relationships, and working on our breathing. All of this is work of the heart, avodah shebalev in Hebrew. And as we conclude, I want to say just one more thing about why I think this heart work is so important. On one level, of course, this is a route to a happier life. None of us wants to be Darth Vader, I hope. I could go for the booming James Earl Jones voice. I could go for that, and I could go for the cape, though I got a cape. But I think I'd be pretty miserable with a life like Darth Vader's, and I imagine you agree. But this isn't just an issue of our personal happiness. I think the stakes are much, much higher. I don't have to tell you that we live in a time of so much isolation, so much disconnection, so much polarization and dehumanization. I think our present and our future as Jews, as Americans, and as human beings depends on doing the heart work that allows us to be present, to be connected, and to be resilient. At a moment when so many changes are happening so rapidly in our world and in our society, when we feel like there is so much to fear sometimes, now more than ever is a time for the spiritual work of the heart. May we support one another in that work. Shabbat shalom, and may the force be with you. Thank you.